Mr Chair, thank you for the call. I'd like to first off acknowledge the work of the Select Committee in this matter. It's been a very good Select Committee and they've worked very hard on this, and we've had tremendous work as well for the Ministry of Justice that's worked right across all the stakeholders in this area. I make no apologies, Mr Chair, for believing that it is time to reform the family court, and I speak from somebody with experience, around 22 years experience as a practising lawyer, and quite a lot of it in the family court area or family law area. And what I know is this, is that couples break up all the time, they split up all the time, and all the time they make sensible arrangements for their children, except if they go into a situation where they are encouraged to not make sensible arrangements, or where they are encouraged to take legal action, where actually we're talking about from day to day in the court about what happens to a child, where they go for Christmas, where they go to school. In fact, it is quite normal, it is quite average, it is quite usual for couples to split up even when they have children. What is not normal or usual is for a child to be asked to have a lawyer to be able to say what they want. Most children can speak to their parents. Most parents can speak to their children. This is not to say that it is not something that should be available when needed. But the fact is that over the last few years, what used to be an unusual occurrence, that a lawyer for a child being appointed, has in fact become the norm. And that is not usual. And it shouldn't be. And the member who's just resumed his seat has talked about the UN. Well, actually, I'm really quite a fan of the UN, but I'd also say this, is that they don't bring up children. And those of us who do bring up children know this, is that actually parents have their first responsibility to their child. Absolutely number one first responsibility before anything else. And a lot of parents I've seen, and that member may want to take a call herself, but I can certainly say from experience is that I've seen plenty of people who have gone through the family court system who have come out the end of it and said, well, we were told we had to go through this, otherwise we weren't be able to get what we needed. Actually, if they'd only sat down and had a chat, they would have had it sorted out. But I make no apology to this House or to anybody else for supporting a family dispute resolution service to try to keep families out of court, to keep mums and dads away from court unless they simply cannot reach agreement, in which case then the court should be involved. But let's give people as many opportunities as we can to resolve their differences around their children, because actually ultimately they are their children and they have a responsibility to it. So this part one deals with amendments to the Care of Children Act 2004. And yes, people may be personally upset that their partner has decided to leave them or go with someone else. Actually, that's no need to use their children to get back at each other. And many of us who have any experience in the legal profession know time and time again that we come across people whose entire lives have been destroyed by being pulled through the family court year after year after year. There are matters that came to my attention as Minister where people spent hundreds of thousands of dollars around access to their own children. And these are not people who are pedophiles, these are not people who abuse their children, these are people who simply wanted to have access to their own children and who were being denied it through a system of abuse of the legal aid system and of the family court, and that is simply not good enough. And so if we can keep people out of court, if we can keep them into taking responsibility for their actions rather than blaming their lawyers and actually taking responsibility for their children, I think that is a very sensible thing. And the member says, who blames the lawyers? Well, having been a lawyer for 22 years, I've listened to a lot of people blame everything on their previous lawyers as they then wanted to, after $200,000 worth of legal fees, now want to settle it. And actually, I think it's incredibly important for people to understand that, yes, people split up. There's no need for these matters to go to court unless every other avenue has been addressed. And people need to be helped to be responsible for their actions. And what we also know is that if we want to see the abuse in the family court system, all we need to do is look at the way that the costs in the last 5 years went right through the roof. 65% increase in legal aid costs out of family courts. And do we think, Mr Chair, do we think for a moment that there was a 65% increase in benefits for the people who were going into the family court? No, unfortunately not. Were there any better outcomes for children? No. Were there any better outcomes generally for families? No. What there was, in fact, is more people encouraged down a route which was going to actually tear them apart as families, but also between children and parents. We all know as parents that it is very tough. It's a very tough job being a parent. Actually, it's even more tough being a 6-year-old child, being asked to have your own lawyer and having to tell your lawyer where you want to live. I cannot understand how anyone can think that it is anything other than, frankly, abuse of a child to require a child aged 6 years old to choose which parent they get to live with. That is like saying to a child, who do you love more, mummy or daddy? That is not fair to a child. That is the role of the parents, and if not the parents, the court. And wherever we have, and the court has the opportunity under this bill to actually appoint a counsel for child if needed, but it should not be the norm. It should be in exceptional circumstances when it is needed, not because the parents are not being encouraged to come up with reasonable decisions about their own children and for the court to be able to make a decision if they cannot reach that. So I make no apology for thinking that parents need to be in charge of their children. They need to put their children first, and they need to put their own personal views about the other parent second, because it's not the child's fault that the parents are split up, and too often children feel it's their fault because the way in which the court system works. So family dispute resolution is something I am absolutely supportive of, as is counselling when needed, when required by a judge or suggested by a judge when it's needed. But actually it's time that governments worked out, and this government does, is that families and parents and adults and children need to be able to get on with their lives, and they don't need to have nanny, whatever it is, a professional organisation interfering in every single thing that they do, and parents will not be encouraged to take responsibility unless they are in fact asked to do so. And Mr Phil Goff may well say that, but he of course oversaw the biggest blowout in legal aid ever. The biggest blowout in legal aid ever. And yet I would think he should be also thinking, who benefited from it? Did the children benefit from it, Mr Goff? No, they did not. Who benefited from it? Certainly not the children. The people who benefited from it, were they the adults, the parents? No, not them. Not one better outcome for all of the money spent on legal fees, on psychologists or anything else. What it did is it strung out costs for years, but it also strung out also massive amounts of litigation that tied these children's lives up for years. And I think anybody who has heard some of the stories that the Select Committee will have heard, that I have heard, that I know of as a practising lawyer before I came to Parliament, know of. Whenever they went to the wrong lawyer, they ended up in litigation. They might have been there for years. And this is not something that should be in the courts unless it's an exceptional circumstance. And then the court needs to act quickly, it needs to act fairly, and it needs to act decisively. And courts should not be asked to relitigate where a child spends Christmas every year. The sort of nonsense that we've seen going through the courts, that is an absolute outrage, that the taxpayer and everyone else and children are being pulled through that sort of nonsense. The courts should be left for big decisions, the decisions around where a child lives, the big decisions about is a child safe. Those are the decisions for the courts, not does a child spend Christmas this year with daddy or mummy. Those are decisions that parents must be encouraged to make for themselves, and only if they can't, then to go to a court. This bill is about changing the way we think about family law. Family law should be about the children and should be about the parents. It should not be about the lawyers, the psychologists and all the other professionals who are very highly paid to do this job. And this bill is an excellent bill. I'd like to thank particularly those members of the Select Committee who undertook to review this law on the basis of what's in the best interest of children.
I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. This bill started out with some very good intentions, and indeed there are